Welcome to the Persuasive Mindset, your podcast guide to mastering the art of persuasion by exploring its role across diverse fields through in-depth conversations with experts. I am your host, Dr. Serena Mate de Londra. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Mario Herberz, a postdoctoral researcher and lecturer at the University of Geneva and a behavioral science consultant who is based in Switzerland. In this episode, Dr. Herberz unveils the subtle art of nudging and persuasion, sharing insights on how behavioral science illuminates cognitive biases and choice architecture that shape our daily decisions. He reflects on his groundbreaking research promoting electric vehicle adoption and its impact on sustainable behavior. We dive into why understanding nudging is essential for making smarter personal choices and driving collective action towards a greener future. As Herberz notes, knowing behavioral sciences helps you to prioritize long-term investments because you understand that as humans we are wired to prioritize immediate pleasures or benefits. As well, he offers practical advice for students and early career professionals on building impactful careers in behavioral sciences. Thus, whether you're passionate about persuasion, sustainability, or career growth, this episode is for you. Now, let's dive into our conversation with Dr. Mario Herberz. Enjoy! As we start our conversation, could you please describe first what is nudging and second, what are behavioral sciences?
The latest definition given by Richard Thaler, who's kind of the champion of nudging nowadays, is that it comprehends all types of interventions that aim to change a behavior into a desired direction as it would be desired by the person herself without restricting freedom of choice and without substantial financial incentives. And behavioral sciences is a little bit more complicated because there are two ways of defining it. One is really just saying that the term behavioral sciences regroups different disciplines: marketing, psychology, neuroscience, behavioral economics, obviously, and it regroups those disciplines scientifically around the work they do in investigating processes that underlie behavior. And so that's the very basic research definition. But then there's also the other definition or another understanding of behavioral sciences more in the policy domain, where behavioral sciences, in my view, are understood as a lens to tackle policy issues. So that's a very common understanding as well, where when you're in the policy domain, when people speak about behavioral sciences, what they mean is that the policy issues, which might be poverty or climate change or consumer rights, social issues, they tackle them with a focus on behavior and an empirical approach, which is not the common way of doing policy.
And how can behavioral sciences help us to better understand our daily decision-making process?
I think what is really interesting about the influence of behavioral science or how it can help us to understand daily decision making is that it can make us aware of the influences on our behavior. So, knowing of behavioral research can help us, even if we walk around in town, to realize how certain contexts are constructed in a way to guide our behaviors, right? I mean, there are traffic lights, right? But there are also supermarkets that are built in a way that make us spend more time inside those supermarkets. So all these choice architecture that surrounds us every day, we can just become more aware of that. And I think that is a very interesting aspect of studying behavioral sciences. But then there's another aspect, a little bit more on the cognitive level, I should say, where we can learn about the cognitive biases and we can also become more aware of the cognitive biases to which our decision making may fall prey. So when we think about, for example, time that we want to invest into something that is very far in the future, then knowing behavioral sciences can help you to prioritize on long-term investments because you know that we as humans, we are made in a way that we always prioritize whatever we can get in the present in terms of pleasure or any other benefits, actually. And we have difficulty to think about long-term goals and to do investments that are necessary for long-term goals. And I think just for this one example of present bias, it can be really useful to study behavioral sciences.
What does the term choice architecture mean within the context of your research?
The term choice architecture is basically a little bit of a synonym of behavioral interventions that can also be understood as nudging, right? What is different when you use the term choice architecture is that the emphasis is much more on the context in which you take a decision and even the structural aspects of these contexts, like how the elevator in a building is positioned as compared to the stairs will influence whether people will take the stairs or the elevator. So that is the aspect that I think most about with the term choice architecture. So choice architecture interventions are not only structural, but there can also be information based, right? But for me, the term choice architecture, as it relates to the architecture, right, to the buildings in which we live, in which we move, I think the metaphor for me, it goes really back also to the original idea of Herbert Simon, who's kind of like one of the godfathers of the discipline of behavioral sciences, who said, well, individuals are one component that will guide behavior, right? And there are cognitive limitations and biases and so on. But the other aspect is the context in which we evolve. And so for me, choice architecture kind of relates back also to that part where it makes a difference how the environment in which we evolve is constructed.
How has the focus on behavioral interventions evolved within recent years?
It's really young. That doesn't mean that behavioral interventions are a new invention. That's not true. There's research on the influence of behavioral norms, and behavioral interventions have been around for decades. But after the publication of the book Nudge, that kind of like boosted this focus on behavioral interventions. And so that's fairly recent.
Could you please describe your research on consumer preferences for electric vehicles?
In this paper on consumer preferences for electric vehicles, what we did was we identified a cognitive bias. So we asked people to what extent they thought that an electric vehicle would meet their mobility needs, right? And people were pretty pessimistic about that. They said that about 50% of their daily travels they would be able to cover with an electric vehicle. And then we also asked them pretty detailed information on their objective driving habits. And so we had their subjective estimates on the one hand. On the other hand, we were able to compute based on their objective travelings how a given electric vehicle with a given battery range would meet those needs. So that gave us like an objective estimate. And then what we observed was that there was a huge gap between what people thought an electric vehicle could get them and what it would actually get them. Because objectively, almost 90% across the board, obviously there are different profiles, right? And some people use the car much more often for very long distances, and then an electric vehicle would not be that fit or would like run into battery range issues much more quickly. But for the very, very large majority of people, more than 90% of their travels with the car would be met by an electric vehicle with a moderate battery range, right? So, because with electric vehicles, not only the issue that people do not adopt them because they have this range anxiety, so they think that the battery range will be insufficient, but then the second problem to that is that people want larger and larger batteries to be sure that it will always cover 100% of your travels. And that is what we also try to kind of combat with this work. And so that was the first part of the research. So we identified this cognitive bias, which we called compatibility bias, because electric vehicles are more compatible than what people thought. And in the second part of this research, we wanted to test a behavioral intervention that might correct for this cognitive bias. And that approach was fairly easy. What we did is we simply took for each individual the information we had about the objective compatibility, so to what extent a given electric vehicle would meet this person's mobility needs, and we presented the participant with this information. So we basically said, look, this is a car that has a range of 300 kilometers, so That's the autonomy of one battery load. And with this battery load, without having to charge extra, you can cover 90% of your daily travels throughout a year. Obviously, there are always some travels that you won't be able to cover with the 300 kilometers range, as going for holidays, for example, but otherwise, this will be perfectly fit to your needs. And what we observed when we compared that with other control conditions that we had designed is that actually making people aware of this cognitive bias, like providing them with the objective information, resulted in a significant increase in participants' willingness to pay for an electric vehicle, in a nutshell.
That's very interesting. And why do people actually exhibit this compatibility bias with electric vehicles?
So we don't have explicit data on that, but what behavioral research would suggest is that people use intuitive decision making quite a bit. So they rely on heuristics to make judgments. And just as well as these judgments of the fit of an electric vehicle and its corresponding battery range with your needs. So what we was suspected to come into play in the genesis of this cognitive bias that we observed is that people, as you just said, think about predominantly, because they're just more salient in their minds, about long distances that they might, like the extreme cases of use. So if I want to take the car to travel for holidays to Spain, then obviously that's much more than the 300 kilometers, for example, battery range. And then this one occasion throughout a whole year where obviously I could find other solutions. I could also just rent a combustion engine vehicle for that one time. They really weigh more heavily in people's decision making. And the other aspect that we thought would come into play based on the literature was that people tend to make binary comparisons. So they tend to compare alternatives when they are next to each other. For example, well, now you have an electric vehicle, and so what you intuitively do is you compare the range of an electric vehicle to the range of a combustion engine vehicle, right? And then this accentuates the lower battery range of the electric vehicle and just makes it look poorer. While this comparison should not be the one you should be doing, the comparison that you should be doing is to what extent does the electric vehicle meet my needs, right? That's what you want to know. You don't want to know to what extent it is comparable or contrast to a combustion engine vehicle.
What real world impact did your electric vehicle research have?
There was quite some attention drawn to that work because we managed to publish it really well. And I think that is a key to wanting to influence policymaking. If you do good work, then it will be recognized. I mean, you still have to do the job of writing a press release so that newspapers also get attracted. But from the outputs that I saw after having published that work, I think that it contributed to integrating the individual-centered perspective in the promotion of electric mobility more broadly. So I think the focus has been, and that's kind of general for the environmental domain, I would say, on technical advancements, right? So we invent new ways of producing renewable energy, and we work on better batteries for electric vehicles. Well, we invent electric vehicles basically, but then the question of who is going to use these technologies is much less in the center of public discourse. So I think what our work did and why it got so much attention is that we really highlighted that you need to take into consideration the individual aspect and how people think about these technologies. What kind of benefits can they draw from these technologies and from electric vehicles in particular? So I think that was kind of like on the public discourse level what this word managed to achieve, which I was very, very happy about. Then, on the level of policy making, I got invited by the cantonal authorities that take care of the promotion of electric vehicles in Geneva. They were very curious about our work, and they shared how they allocate different budgets to the development of charging infrastructure in communication campaigns and so on. And I think they liked our work, but then I don't know whether they integrated the kind of insights that we had shared into their work, because policymaking is a very complex process as well, I've learned. And everything you can do is to make your work understandable, share it, highlight the values of it, and then they need to take it up or not. Research is just one piece of information that will be integrated into the policymaking process, but there are many other influences that are not research based, which is just the way how policymaking works in our societies.
It would be interesting to know what has sparked your interest in behavioral sciences.
I studied psychology at the University of Heidelberg in Germany in my bachelor's and in my master's. And I think what got me going into behavioral sciences were courses taught on judgment and decision making, which is a research field that was founded basically by two researchers, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. I think some of you might know the book Thinking Fast and Slow, which kind of summarizes their first findings in that field. And so this research on judgment and decision making looks into how people make judgments and decisions and use heuristics in comparison to more rational ways of integrating more comprehensively all available information, and to what extent that changes the way we take decisions. And then I was lucky to meet scholars that we're already looking into the applied benefits that this approach to understanding human behavior might have. So I got familiar with work on promoting vaccination in the global south, for example, and so on. Most of the work in behavioral sciences, as people might know, are in the field of health behavior. So how can you guide better health action in vulnerable populations mostly? And that's what got me thinking and what got me passionate. I think I got really passionate about the applied benefits that this research might have. And that's how I then started this PhD on this approach, but in the environmental domain.
How did your PhD research actually align with policymaking?
My PhD, and I think maybe if you think about the policy impact or the relation of my research to policy making, what is interesting to know is that my project was funded by the Swiss Federal Office for Energy. And so that already made my research really close to policymaking, if you want. So the Swiss Federal Office for Energy was interested in better understanding people's reluctance to adopt electric vehicle or more fuel efficient vehicles more generally. And so they wanted us to take this lens of behavioral sciences to better understand consumer preferences in that context. I did also some work a little bit more broadly on policy preferences in the climate domain, which could be the promotion of electric vehicles by the state, for example. And I also looked into preferences for other sustainable mobility options, such as electric bikes or just more fuel efficient cars. But very generally, the strongest focus of my work was on electric mobility and electric vehicles and consumer preferences.
Could you share with us where are you originally from and how did you initially learn about the PhD opportunity in Geneva?
I grew up close to Frankfurt in a small student town called Marburg in Germany, and then moved from there to Heidelberg, which is close to Frankfurt for people that are not from Germany. And that's where I studied. How did I become aware about the PhD position? Was simply through the advertisement of the lab director, Tobias Brosch at the University of Geneva, who advertised this position in collaboration with the Swiss Federal Office for Energy on also some German networks. And then there was one thing that I thought the project was a really good fit, because it really wanted to use this judgment and decision-making approach in the context of environmental action. And on the other hand, I was also curious to move to Geneva and discover a different world, because I already spoke French. So there were also some personal arguments that made me take this decision.
How do you manage to balance your role as a researcher with activism or persuasion?
I think the role as an academic researcher is that you try to be impartial. I mean, research will always be funded by someone, right? But I think now with the kind of the research crisis that we observe in the US, I think we realize to what extent researchers at universities are free to do the research that they think is the most valuable. And the goal is to get closer to the truth state of the world, if you think about all kind of disciplines for academic research. And that should not be influenced, obviously, by political goals, although by funding institutions, obviously, they can guide, they can provide funding for certain research topics. As it was done for me, it was clearly focused on electric vehicles, but I think it still stays then really open to how you do this research and how do you get closer to the true state and collect that evidence. So that's for me the academic research side. And then you have activism where you promote a certain goal. So I think if you speak about persuasion, I think you can do research that is persuasive, okay? Because you provide evidence that is a good argument to go into a certain direction. But I don't think that you are, as a researcher, you should be persuading. So it's a little bit contradictory, maybe, but that's how I see it. And then on the other hand, activism is for me really like agenda setting, right? So really, you stand behind a goal and you really try to do everything you can to promote that goal and convince authorities to pay attention to an issue that you're concerned about. And so then I think you're much more in the persuasion and also in the kind of like trying to get a movement going around an issue, right? Where you try to connect people and partners to make an issue advance or solutions to an issue advance or be tackled by public authorities. So that's for me more the activism part. But then as a researcher, you can move between the two worlds. I mean, there are researchers that interpret their role in society very differently. Some are clearly more on the research academic side, but there are others that also take really activist positions.
Could you please describe what are your main responsibilities as a researcher?
The priority of my work and of my job description is to do research. So that's my main activity. So that's what I dedicate most of my time to. That, but it also means there are also intersections where teaching, for example, is also like I supervise master students for their master thesis. And so they conduct research and I supervise this research, which is still considered teaching because I supervise them. So that's my main activity. And then I think communication always comes into play when either we publish work that attracts attention from the society and from newspapers, for example, and then we engage in explaining our work in an understandable way and so on. But I think that's very punctual. It stays quite punctual, these kind of interventions. Another way I communicate about our work or about the approach of behavioral sciences to policy issues is through conferences and roundtables and panel discussions. And that, again, I need to fit that into my agenda. As for the consulting activities that I've been doing, you need to make selections, right? So at some point, you cannot say yes to everything and to keep a balance because as a researcher, it's appreciated if you do these connections with the outside world. And I think for me, it's very valuable because it also keeps me motivated and I really enjoy it. But you need to fit that into your day-to-day business and obligations.
How can researchers ensure that their work manages to reach a broader audience?
Well, I think depending on how you consider the importance of your work as a researcher, you should try to promote your work beyond scientific publications, obviously, like you say, because publishing in a scientific journal is for a very, very specialized audience. It's also in a format that like many people are unfamiliar with. So it's not really digest, right? So what you need to do is to, like I mentioned earlier, one good idea is when you have a nice publication to reach out to the press office of your university. And then they are journalists and they can advise you on how to write up a press release that will be understood by the general public and by journals and newspapers that have a broader audience. So I think that's your responsibility to make this extra step if you really want to have an impact. I think that's indispensable.
Based on your experience, which conferences do you find valuable for advancing your work?
I go to two conferences regularly, and one of them is the European Association of Decision Making, which is kind of like the sister association of the American Society for Judgment and Decision Making. And the EADM conference has a really weird name, which is Subjective Probability and Utility in Decision Making. But that is a conference that always takes place in Europe biannually. And I think it is a great conference because you have people from all kind of contexts that work on really different topics. You have also quite some researchers that do basic research on judgment and decision making. But if you're interested in applied topics, I think it's really important also to continue to be inspired by basic research of people that are smart and that do great work that doesn't really have an applied value yet, but that you might be able to turn into applied value by applying these concepts to applied issues that you are passionate about. So that's why I really like to go to that conference, because you exchange with really smart people and scholars from all kind of disciplines, and that can inspire you and motivate you to do great work. Also, they are really strong methodologically. And then I always complemented that with a conference that is more focused on environmental behavior, which is the International Conference for Environmental Psychology. So there you are among psychologists. So you have methodology that is much more psychological. So people that construct scales and lots of questionnaire data, little bit less experimental work, for example. And I think to achieve good value of your work, you always need to run experiments, right? Like you do in the natural sciences as well, or how you test medication. You always need to have solid causal evidence of what you're looking at. And so this other conference is more to surround myself with people that work on environmental topics and also get more of the applied side of which topics are important at the moment and how to tackle them.
What are your views on the concept of persuasion, and does it actually play a role in your work or studies?
For me, persuasion draws a contrast a little bit with a more widespread general approach of behavioral sciences. For me, behavioral sciences tries to find solutions for whole populations. For me, persuasion is really much more individual centered. So you try to persuade an individual person with arguments that are fit to convince that individual person. So for me, there is a clear distinction with an approach of behavioral sciences, although the work of Bob Cialdini, who has written the book on persuasion, is clearly also in the behavioral sciences domain. So, how that relates to my work is, I think that what I've been doing mostly, because I think I've been using this more conventional way of applying behavioral sciences and trying to find solutions for whole populations and not for individuals. I think, like I mentioned earlier already, is that I try to provide evidence that persuades someone or a larger audience about the benefits of a certain option or about a right behavior to adopt. But I don't think that I've been doing much of persuasion as I kind of like have the original understanding of the term, where I try to convince an individual person, where you can have persuasive strategies of foot in the door technique. I mean, that is behavioral sciences as well, right? Where you kind of ask a little favor of someone for your cause, such as signing a petition, and then you get back to that person and ask her about donating money for the same cause. And then research would suggest that people want to be coherent with their actions, and they are more likely, if you have put your foot into the door with a petition signing, to also donate money. So that for me would be much more already persuasion than what I've been doing, where basically most of the interventions I've been using are information based, where I used arguments very selectively in a persuasive way.
What advice would you give to students who are interested in the field of behavioral sciences?
During one advice to PhD students webinar, I think, where Richard Thaler spoke, he said something that resonated a lot with me, which was that he has the impression that young scholars and PhD students, they read a lot, but they don't think as much as they read. So what I think is really important in that statement, and how I think I'm also convinced that that is very important, is that you need to be curious about a topic. Okay, you need to be curious about an issue and passionate about it, obviously. And then you need to have that background, which is all the reading that you've done in behavioral sciences. But then you also need to take the time to just think logically about a problem and think openly, and not want to stay too close to the concepts and the literature that you've been using. You know that stuff at some point, and you know the way of running research in behavioral sciences and the concepts and so on. But I think what has helped me to sometimes stick out with some of the work that I've done is that I've always tried to think as independently as possible about a certain issue and to look for flaws or stuff that other people haven't thought about in a given context. And I think that is sometimes a neglected part in research, where you try to accumulate all that knowledge and to integrate all that knowledge that is available in a given field. And it's important to know what's going on in a field, but if you want to do good research, I would recommend to also just discuss with other people that are interested in the same topic and really just think about it. And that can be really, really valuable, and even more valuable, maybe. And I think if you're interested in applied context, you won't stay motivated and you won't advance as well if you stay within the academic ivory tower. But that, I think, is kind of a recommendation that is pretty common. So you need to build context with people, with other professionals outside of universities, to stay up to date. And if you want to do policy relevant research and to get those opportunities only open up if you go to conferences where there are not only academic researchers in the audience. So that, I think, is really, really important if you want to do that kind of work.
And that concludes our conversation for today. If you enjoyed it, please be sure to subscribe, leave a comment, and share this episode with others who might benefit from it. Until next time, be well!